That is James Mennie. He is over at the Montreal Gazette. And Jim, clearly the most exciting day of the year now that the CAC cabinet shuffle has been completed. How exciting a day was this?
Well, yeah, as you say, rather ironically, because this thing was leaking more than the Titanic, so we kind of knew even before anybody, held up their hand and solemnly affirmed who was going to get what job. Have you heard his speech in the wake of these announcements, though? Because I think it's very, very revealing when the Premier of Quebec basically says, at my age, I don't have to worry about being in a popularity contest. The only motivation I have is my love of the Quebec people. This in a speech where he described, the ever-growing civil service as a straitjacket that Quebec needs to be freed from, and I have to engage in some shock treatment to get this problem solved. And all of a sudden, it's like he's quoting the gospel from Nurse Ratched. But I got to tell you, there's even more reason to be worried here. I'm getting the impression, and thank you so much for really going through that whole litany of appointments, because when you look at who's moved, I mean, who stayed where they are is very interesting as well, because that would presume he's happy. Monsieur Legault is happy with the status quo, whether it's the state of Quebec's economy, whether it's the ongoing war that they are going to launch against public sector unions with various legislation that will limit, if not eliminate, their right to strike. Here we have Geneviève Guilbeault, who, rightly or wrongly, is got thrown under a bus for the SAC-Click scandal. She's been named Minister of Municipal Affairs. Yes, the incumbent announced she was not going to seek re-election. She's going to leave politics, so that's fine. The job is open. Geneviève Guilbeault, the last time we heard Geneviève Guilbeault dealing with the province's mayors, she was getting a big scrap with them over the funding for right. Public transit, and it really got ugly. I mean, there were mayors, basically taking a tone with Quebec that you don't usually hear mayors take, but that was the level of acrimony and how can I put it, just negative vibes between Guilbeault and the mayors. And now she's the minister responsible for municipal affairs. The other thing which is very unusual, and I want to be careful here because it's kind of a double-barrel thing. Yann Lafrenière, we all know him. Our listeners know him better as a former Montreal police officer. He's a spokesman for the police force. He was named minister responsible for relations with First Nations, and he did a great job. Okay, not a lot of fanfare, but he really mended a lot of offenses with First Nations in Quebec. Well, he has now been named Minister of Public Security, and there are two things that you're scratching your head over. First, I wonder how the First Nations feel that their portfolio is now considered a kind of addendum, because Lafrenière still keeps the portfolio, but he's also in charge now of the extremely demanding, non-stop public security portfolio. And the other thing is, him being a cop, Aaron, you can throw a stick and you will hit 50 ex-cops who are deputy ministers of public security. As far as I know, this is the first time a former police officer has been named to that ministry. Because why? Because there was always the idea that, this guy's going to take the cop's side all the time, and he should be neutral, he should be there for Quebecers, and blah, 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 blah. But what really I find interesting about this is that, and Yann Lafrenière, as his job was being a media spokesman, he's a very, very good communicator. This was the other thing, apart from the shock treatment and the straitjackets, Aaron, it's a law and order. That's law and order, my friend. François Legault, special victims unit, going to go in there. He's going to go after the gangs. He's going to go after the street crime. He's going to go after the child trafficking. In other words, he is going to launch an anti-crime wave against the evil island of Montreal. Let's face it, that's where the crime is. When the Premier's talking about coming down on crime, he's not talking about a bunch of cigarette smugglers out in the gas bay. This is going to target Montreal. So get ready to hear François Legault, whose main political one-trick pony is to create des chicanes, is going to turn around and make it clear that Montreal is a nest of crime that's got to be dealt with. The mayors, they're always complaining. They want more money. They're going to have to be dealt with. The idea as well, when he refers to Quebec having been I'm quoting here, submerged, and that is not too strong a word, by an explosion of immigration. Gee, I wonder how much more fun we're going to have with that whole dossier, this whole idea of identity, as this ever increasingly desperate government tries to take pull some new raggedy, mangy rabbit out of a hat and try and convince Quebecers that they're the government to go. But I tell you, Aaron, and we've been having this conversation for weeks now about the idea that Legault is going to take it on the arches early, maybe around Christmas, whatever. One reporter, I don't know who it was, they asked Pablo Rodriguez, the Liberal leader, Quebec Liberal leader, are you ready for an election if there's an early election call? And, that occurred to me, how much you want to bet that if the numbers even start to turn around, that if all of this fear-mongering, if all of this the chicanerie, if all of this confrontation with everybody, all in favor of, du vrai monde du Québec, okay? Because let's face it, François Legault won 2 big terms without Montreal. He doesn't need Montreal as anything other than a scapegoat. How much you want to bet he does call an early election? I think that's where we are. I think everything's in a state of flux right now. Everything is on the table because the desperation is absolutely palpable. And as you pointed out, a lot of people who had, the key jobs, and even though Christian Dubé is leaving, he gets to stay in the health portfolio. Moving Sonia Lebel, former Treasury Board president, into education, I find to be very interesting because that nomination is being greeted with very cautious optimism by the unions because they know her from she was the one across from the negotiating table, Aaron. But here's the thing: in his entire list of priorities, that nice François Legault never once mentioned education in any way, shape, or form.
So go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
It seems to me that everything here, there's a reason for it, but it's not the one you think. I think, with all due respect to Ms. Lebel, I think she's in there to mend fences with the unions and to really, how can I put it, sell the budget cuts that Bernard Drinville had such a hard time, let alone explaining, never mind carrying out. So I think that's going to be a very, very interesting part of her mandate. And as I say, the idea that, this ridiculous deficit that is run up by the government. Oh, by the way, I didn't want to give credit where credit's due. François Legault, who's complaining that, there's too big a civil service. Remember, he ran in his first term on cutting the civil service by 5,000. As we speak, there are an additional 10,000 people under Legault's watch in the civil service. So this will be fun to watch in one bizarre way, Aaron.
Jim, I got a couple of questions. With respect to your analysis, when you talked about Yann Lafreniere and his appointment as public security minister now, specifically, you look at this as a direct attack on Montreal or direct focus on Montreal. Why?
Not via Yann Lafreniere. I think the idea, though, that the visual of putting a former police officer in charge of basically policing in Quebec, of having the premier say, it's a matter of law and order, we've got to go after crime. To mention Montreal by name, he doesn't have to. That's where all the headlines are coming from, Aaron. Mm-hmm. We are having this, and more we are seeing the impression, we were talking about it this week, that people are scared of Montreal, right. They're scared of what's happening in the city. And don't forget, whenever François Legault can, he wants to cut the grass from under the Parti Québécois, and it was Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon who suggested, that youth crime, how much you want to bet that, immigration's responsible in part for that.
Right.
So once again, we're entering that very ugly, dank, fetid swamp of identity politics. I don't think things are going to get better for a lot of people who have already been annoyed by this government. This cabinet change does not, give me any kind of hope. Or it was certainly not a reset. I think, though, keep your eye on Legault. Christmas, he may go. And frankly, if the numbers do change, even if they go up slightly, don't be surprised if they just bet everything on, black 14 on the roulette table and call an early election.
All right, last thing before we run out of time. Bernard Drinville going from education to environment, the same guy who famously now, and I'm seeing this everywhere today, came out when he was a minister and said, what is it? Don't bother me with greenhouse gases. This is now the minister of the environment.
Yeah, he's now minister of the environment, but I have to tell you, because we are nothing if not fair here on Montreal Now, his predecessor, Benoit Charette, the Minister of Environment, when talking about the third link between Quebec City and Lévis, said, I don't care what any study finds, this project is going through.
Okay,
so you know what I mean?
Famous last words. Yeah, okay.
It's a tradition, buddy.
I get it. Last thing, what do you make of Eric Girard losing this, relations with Anglos, going back to Chris Skeet? Anything?
You're talking to the guy who nearly blew a blood vessel when they named Jean-François Lisée the very first minister responsible for Anglos. It doesn't matter who has a portfolio, Aaron. For all intents and purposes, and certainly in our listeners' interest, there's nobody home.
Okay. I just remember Chris Skeet being very available when he was minister responsible for relations. So maybe that's a good thing.
Everything was great. And here we are years afterwards. And aren't things great, Aaron?
And we'll leave it at that. James Mennie over at the Montreal Gazette. Thank you, Jim.
Let's
go to traffic. CJAD 800 Traffic Center. Lauren Glazer's got an update for us. Lauren.